Natalie Wood was found dead in the waters off California's Catalina Island in late November 1981, and the first headlines carried a deceptively simple conclusion: accidental drowning. But the case never stayed simple. For more than 4 decades, it has remained one of Hollywood's most persistent mysteries, fueled by disputed timelines, shifting witness accounts, and official decisions that later acknowledged uncertainty. At the center of the story is a small group on the yacht Splendor: Natalie Wood, her husband Robert Wagner, actor Christopher Walken, and the boat's captain, Dennis Davern. According to widely repeated accounts, the night was marked by drinking and tension. Somewhere around late evening, Natalie disappeared. What happened next is the detail that continues to haunt public discussion: the delay. Critics of the accident narrative focus on the gap between the last time Natalie was reportedly seen and the moment authorities were contacted. In rough, cold conditions, time is the most valuable asset. Delay can mean the difference between rescue and recovery. That alleged delay became even more troubling because of claims, most notably attributed to the yacht's captain in later years, that search efforts were discouraged rather than escalated. Over time, Davern's public stance evolved. In early accounts, he appeared to support the idea that Natalie slipped while dealing with the dinghy. Later, he suggested a more volatile atmosphere on board and implied that events were not handled as an immediate emergency. Whether one views this evolution as conscience-driven truth-telling or as unreliable revisionism, it became one of the key reasons the case remained alive in the public imagination. Official actions also shifted the story's footing. In 2011, authorities reopened the investigation. In 2012, the Los Angeles County Coroner amended Natalie Wood's death certificate from accidental drowning to drowning and other undetermined factors, a formal sign that the original conclusion no longer fully satisfied the available information. Years later, in 2018, investigators publicly described Robert Wagner as a person of interest, pointing to inconsistencies in accounts and the basic fact that he was the last person known to be with Natalie before she vanished. The power of this case lies in how its pieces interlock without sealing shut. Independent witnesses later claimed they heard a woman crying for help across the water. Natalie's well-known fear of dark water is often cited as a behavioral contradiction to the idea that she would voluntarily go out alone at night in rough conditions. The toxicology findings and injury descriptions, as discussed in media coverage, added another layer of ambiguity, enough to make accident feel incomplete, but not enough to produce a definitive legal ending. This is why the case endures, not because it is solved, but because it is structurally unresolved. Each element, time gaps, changed testimony, official amendments, pushes the story away from certainty and toward questions that, decades later, still refuse to settle. The most troubling and frequently debated aspect of Natalie Wood's death is not a single allegation, but a sequence of decisions made after she disappeared. In maritime emergencies, procedure is unforgivingly clear. Activate lights, raise alarms, notify authorities immediately, and begin a coordinated search. On the night of November 28, 1981, however, what allegedly unfolded aboard the yacht Splendor appears, at least in hindsight, to deviate from that logic in ways that continue to unsettle investigators and the public alike. According to later reported timelines, Natalie was last seen sometime around late evening, after a night of heavy drinking and escalating tension on board. Witnesses, including the yacht's captain, Dennis Davern, would later describe an atmosphere that was far from calm. Yet despite Natalie's sudden absence, hours passed before the U.S. Coast Guard was notified. In cold, windy conditions off Catalina Island, such a delay is not a minor procedural lapse. It is potentially fatal. Every minute in dark, choppy water drastically reduces survival chances. What deepened suspicion was not only the passage of time, but the explanation for it. In later interviews and sworn statements, Davern claimed that he was instructed not to turn on the yacht's searchlights and not to call for help immediately. If true, this choice contradicts standard emergency response and suggests an active decision to avoid attention. Supporters of Robert Wagner argue that shock, intoxication, and confusion can impair judgment in crisis situations. Critics counter that confusion typically produces frantic overreaction, not controlled restraint. This question, confusion or control, sits at the heart of the case. If Natalie's disappearance was believed to be an accident, the rational response would have been urgency and visibility. Instead, the alleged response, as described years later, appeared cautious and inward-looking. That behavior alone does not prove wrongdoing, but it introduces motive-adjacent possibilities: fear of scandal, fear of legal exposure, or fear of revealing what had just transpired on board. Davern's evolving testimony amplified this uncertainty. For years, he maintained the original narrative that Natalie slipped while trying to secure a dinghy. Then, decades later, he recanted key elements, stating that he felt pressure to remain silent and that the situation aboard the yacht was volatile. He described loud arguments, jealousy, and emotional instability, conditions inconsistent with the calm evening originally portrayed. His transformation from supportive witness to vocal critic became one of the most controversial elements of the case. Skeptics question his credibility due to the time gap. Others argue that delayed truth-telling is common when power dynamics and fear are involved. Law enforcement later acknowledged that the delay significantly damaged the investigation. Investigators have stated that had authorities been called immediately, the chances of determining exactly what happened, or even saving Natalie, would have been far greater. That admission reframed the delay from a tragic footnote into a central structural failure. It also reframed Wagner's role, not as an accused criminal, but as the person whose decisions defined the critical window when Natalie might still have been alive. This shift in perspective was reflected years later when authorities reopened the case and ultimately identified Wagner as a person of interest. The designation was not a charge, but it signaled that investigators believed inconsistencies and behavioral decisions mattered. Wagner's own account had changed over time, including later admissions about an argument on board that he had initially minimized. Each adjustment, even if minor in isolation, compounded the sense that the original story was incomplete. The delayed alarm also intersects with other haunting claims. Independent witnesses who later reported hearing a woman crying for help, and Natalie's documented fear of dark water. Together, these details suggest the possibility that she was conscious, alive, and in distress for a period of time. If so, the delay becomes more than procedural, it becomes moral. Ultimately, the significance of the delay lies not in proving intent, but in undermining certainty. It is the first crack in the foundation of the simple accident explanation. Once that crack appears, every subsequent detail, testimony, injuries, silence, falls into a different light. And it is that light, harsh and unresolved, that continues to keep Natalie Wood's death from fading into history. The mystery surrounding Natalie Wood's death deepened significantly when testimony from those closest to the event began to change. At the center of this shift was the yacht's captain, Dennis Davern, whose evolving account transformed the case from a tragic accident into a long-running controversy. In true crime history, few elements are as polarizing as a witness who revises their story decades later. To some, it signals dishonesty. To others, it represents delayed truth finally breaking through fear, loyalty, or pressure. In the immediate aftermath of Natalie's drowning in 1981, Davern publicly supported Robert Wagner's version of events. The narrative was straightforward. Natalie allegedly went on deck to secure a dinghy that was making noise and accidentally slipped into the water. There was no violent argument, no dramatic confrontation, just a fatal mishap compounded by alcohol and bad weather. This account allowed the case to close quickly and spared everyone involved from deeper scrutiny. Years later, however, Davern's story began to fracture. In interviews during the early 2000s and beyond, he stated that the atmosphere aboard the yacht Splendor had been tense and emotionally charged. According to his later claims, heavy drinking fueled a volatile argument between Natalie and Robert Wagner. allegedly sparked by jealousy over her professional relationship with Christopher Walken, who was also on board that night. Davern described hearing raised voices, objects being moved or thrown, and a level of anger that contradicted the calm evening originally portrayed. Most damaging were Davern's assertions about what happened after Natalie went missing. He claimed that Wagner instructed him not to turn on the yacht's searchlights and not to call for help immediately. In maritime emergencies, these actions are fundamental. If Davern's later account is accurate, it suggests that the delay was not simply confusion, but a conscious decision. Davern went further, stating that he felt pressured to lie to investigators in 1981 and to align his account with Wagner's version of events. Critics of Davern point to obvious weaknesses. Memory degrades over time. Public attention can incentivize dramatic retellings. Books, interviews, and documentaries can blur the line between recollection and reconstruction. Why? They ask, would someone wait decades to reveal such critical information if it were true? Supporters counter with a different question. Why would a captain implicate himself in negligence unless he felt compelled by guilt or conscience? Law enforcement's response to Davern's revised testimony gave it added weight. When the case was reopened in 2011, authorities stated that his updated account was considered credible enough to warrant further investigation. This did not mean investigators accepted everything he said as fact, but it did mean his testimony could no longer be dismissed outright. It also meant the original investigation was no longer treated as definitive. This evolution reshaped how Robert Wagner's behavior was interpreted. In 1981, his actions were largely taken at face value. Years later, the same actions, particularly the delay in reporting Natalie missing, were viewed through a harsher lens. Wagner's own narrative also shifted. While he initially denied any serious conflict that night, he later acknowledged an intense argument with Christopher Walken and admitted to smashing a wine bottle in anger. That admission alone raised an uncomfortable question. If this detail was omitted originally, what else might have been minimized or excluded? Investigators noted that Wagner's statements over time did not align neatly with those of other witnesses. This inconsistency, combined with his refusal to participate in later interviews with authorities, led to his designation as a person of interest in 2018. Legally, this label does not imply guilt. Symbolically, however, it signaled that Wagner was no longer viewed as a peripheral figure in an unfortunate accident, but as a central figure whose decisions and statements were critical to understanding what happened. The silence of Christopher Walken added another layer of tension. Aside from one limited interview years later, Walken has largely declined to comment publicly on the events of that night. His restraint has been interpreted in conflicting ways, as respect for the dead, as legal caution, or as avoidance. In a case built on missing minutes and withheld words, even silence becomes evidence in the court of public opinion. The cumulative effect of these shifting testimonies is not proof of murder, but erosion of certainty. The original explanation depended on consistency: a calm night, a sudden accident, an unfortunate delay. Once that consistency collapsed, the narrative fractured into competing possibilities. Was there an argument that escalated beyond control? Was there an accidental fall followed by panic and poor judgment? Or was there a conscious attempt to manage appearances before involving authorities? What makes this phase of the story so powerful is that it highlights how truth in high-profile cases is often negotiated over time. Power, fear, loyalty, and reputation can shape what is said immediately after a tragedy. Decades later, when stakes shift and guilt lingers, stories can change. Whether those changes reveal truth or create myth is rarely clear. In the Natalie Wood case, the captain's evolving testimony did not solve the mystery, but it permanently altered its trajectory. It forced investigators, journalists, and the public to reconsider the night on the Splendor not as a closed chapter, but as a scene still echoing with unanswered questions. And once those questions took hold, the story could no longer return to the simplicity of accidental drowning. The case surrounding Natalie Wood's death grew even darker as independent witness accounts, forensic questions, and behavioral contradictions began to surface, each adding pressure to the already fragile, accidental drowning explanation. By this stage, the mystery was no longer anchored solely to what happened on the yacht Splendor, but to what may have happened in the surrounding waters, unseen yet possibly heard. One of the most chilling elements introduced into the public record came from witnesses who were not part of the celebrity circle at all. Marilyn Wayne and John Payne, a couple staying on a nearby boat the same night Natalie disappeared, later stated that they were awakened by the sound of a woman screaming for help. According to their accounts, the cries were desperate and repeated, variations of "help me, I'm drowning," and continued for several minutes before fading away. Payne corroborated Wayne's testimony, recalling not only the woman's voice, but also what he described as a calm male response from a distance. The significance of this testimony is profound, even if it remains circumstantial. If the cries were real and sustained, they undermine the idea that Natalie slipped silently into the water and drowned immediately. Instead, they suggest the possibility that she was conscious, struggling, and alive for a meaningful period of time. In that context, the earlier reported delay in launching a search takes on a far more disturbing implication. A window for rescue may have existed and closed. Skeptics rightly point out the limitations of such testimony. Sound travels unpredictably over water. Time perception during nighttime events is unreliable. Memory, especially recalled years later, is vulnerable to distortion. Yet what keeps these accounts alive is not their standalone certainty, but how well they align with other unresolved aspects of the case. The delayed alarm, the alleged refusal to activate searchlights, and the broader pattern of hesitation rather than urgency. Another major fault line in the accident narrative is Natalie Wood's well-documented fear of dark water. This was not a casual discomfort. Family members, friends, and biographers have long stated that Natalie was deeply afraid of open, dark water, a fear rooted in childhood and reinforced throughout her life. According to her sister, Lana Wood, Natalie would never have gone alone onto the deck of a boat at night, particularly in rough conditions, and certainly not to climb into or near a dinghy. This behavioral context does not make an accident impossible, but makes it less intuitive. For the original explanation to hold, Natalie would have had to override a lifelong phobia, while intoxicated in stormy conditions, without alerting anyone else on board. Critics argue that such a chain of decisions stretches plausibility. Supporters of the accident theory counter that alcohol and medication can impair judgment and reduce inhibitions. Once again, the evidence does not close the case, it splits it. The clothing Natalie was wearing when her body was found added another layer of uncertainty. Reports described her in a nightgown, socks, and a coat, attire that suggests she was not dressed for purposeful activity on deck. It does not resemble clothing worn to perform a task involving ropes, water, or a small boat. This detail fueled speculation that she may not have planned to go outside at all, or that her movement onto the deck occurred under unusual or pressured circumstances. Forensic findings complicated matters further. Toxicology reports showed that Natalie had a high blood alcohol level and had taken medications known to increase drowsiness and impair coordination. On one hand, this supports the possibility of an accidental fall. On the other, the autopsy documented bruises and abrasions on her body, including injuries that some later observers questioned as inconsistent with a simple fall into the sea. While early investigators suggested these injuries could have occurred as her body drifted or struck surfaces, later reviews acknowledged that not all marks could be easily explained. This accumulation of unresolved details led to a crucial institutional shift. In 2012, the Los Angeles County Coroner amended Natalie Wood's death certificate to state drowning and other undetermined factors. That change did not accuse anyone of a crime, but it formally recognized what the public had debated for years. The available evidence did not support a clean, singular explanation. The The cause of death was no longer settled. At this stage, the mystery entered a different phase. The question was no longer, was it an accident or not, but why is the story so resistant to closure? The answer may lie less in one dramatic act and more in a convergence of human failures, fear, conflict, delayed decisions, and a powerful desire to control outcomes in the face of scandal. Whether Natalie Wood's death was the result of an accident compounded by panic or something more deliberate remains unresolved. But by the time these witness accounts, behavioral contradictions, and forensic ambiguities were fully aired, the original narrative had lost its authority. What replaced it was not a new certainty, but a permanent question, one that continues to echo across the water where Natalie was last heard and last seen. As the Natalie Wood case moved further from the night of her death and deeper into historical re-examination, the focus shifted from isolated details to a broader pattern, one defined by inconsistency, silence, and institutional reassessment. At the center of this phase stands Robert Wagner himself, not as a convicted figure, but as the individual whose evolving narrative and decisions have become inseparable from the unanswered questions. In the immediate aftermath of Natalie's death in 1981, Wagner's account was clear and concise. He told investigators that Natalie likely went on deck to secure a dinghy that had been making noise and accidentally fell into the water. He described the evening as relatively calm, denied any significant argument, and expressed shock at her disappearance. This explanation was accepted by authorities at the time, contributing to the swift classification of her death as accidental. Over the years, however, Wagner's version of events changed in subtle but meaningful ways. When the case was reopened decades later, he acknowledged that the atmosphere on the yacht had not been as peaceful as initially suggested. He admitted to a heated argument with actor Christopher Walken over Natalie's career and conceded that, in a moment of anger, he smashed a bottle of wine. This admission marked a significant departure from his earlier statements, raising an unavoidable question. If this detail was omitted in 1981, what else may have been minimized or withheld? In high-profile investigations, inconsistency alone does not establish guilt. Memory can fade, trauma can distort recollection, and people often recall events differently over time. Yet investigators are trained to treat changing narratives as warning signs, especially when those changes involve the emotional intensity of an event. Wagner's later acknowledgments aligned more closely with what other witnesses, particularly the yacht's captain, had been claiming for years, that the night was volatile, not routine. This shift in Wagner's story coincided with a broader institutional reevaluation of the case. In 2011, authorities reopened the investigation, citing new witness statements and unresolved discrepancies. The following year, the coroner amended Natalie Wood's death certificate to read, "drowning and other undetermined factors." That change was critical. It did not accuse Wagner or anyone else of a crime, but it formally withdrew the certainty that had protected the original narrative for decades. By 2018, law enforcement took an even more public step. Investigators described Wagner as a person of interest, emphasizing that he was the last person known to be with Natalie before she disappeared, and that his account did not fully align with other testimonies. This designation carried enormous symbolic weight. In legal terms, it meant little more than continued investigative attention. In public perception, it reframed Wagner from grieving widower to unresolved question. Equally significant was Wagner's response, or lack of one. Following the reopening of the case, he declined to sit for additional interviews with investigators. Legally, this is a right, not an admission. Defense attorneys often advise silence in reopened cases, particularly when statements could be misconstrued or weaponized. Still, in the court of public opinion, silence can be interpreted as avoidance. The contrast between Wagner's refusal to speak and the willingness of other figures, such as Dennis Davern, to revise and expand their accounts only intensified suspicion. Christopher Walken's near-total silence also contributed to the tension. Aside from a single interview years later, in which he largely echoed Wagner's early explanation, Wagner has avoided public discussion of the night. His restraint has been interpreted in multiple ways: loyalty, legal caution, emotional discomfort, or simple exhaustion with speculation. Yet his absence from the narrative leaves a vacuum, one that audiences instinctively fill with conjecture. As scrutiny grew, the case began to reflect a larger critique of Hollywood's historical culture of protection and image management. In the early 1980s, powerful actors and studios operated within an environment that often discouraged aggressive investigation into personal scandals. The speed with which Natalie Wood's death was ruled an accident, combined with the lack of follow-up on contradictory details, has led many to argue that celebrity status shaped the original outcome. Whether this was a conscious cover-up or a passive bias remains debated, but the perception itself has become part of the case's legacy. This broader context does not prove that Natalie Wood was murdered. What it does explain is why the case has resisted closure. When authority retreats from certainty, by reopening investigations, amending official records, and publicly naming persons of interest, the story cannot return to its original simplicity. Each institutional adjustment validates public doubt, even in the absence of a final legal conclusion. By this stage, the Natalie Wood mystery had transformed from a single tragic event into a study of how truth is shaped, delayed, and sometimes obscured by power, fear, and time. Wagner's changing statements, his silence, and his central role in the timeline ensure that his name remains inseparable from the case, regardless of legal outcomes. What remains is not a solved crime, but a fractured narrative. One version says accident. Another says negligence. Others suggest something darker. None have been definitively proven, yet none have been dismissed. And as long as those competing explanations coexist, anchored by official uncertainty and human contradiction, the story of Natalie Wood's final night will remain unresolved, suspended between what is known and what may never be fully revealed. As the investigation into Natalie Wood's death continued to evolve, one figure emerged as the emotional and moral anchor of the case: her younger sister, Lana Wood. Unlike investigators bound by procedure or witnesses constrained by memory and liability, Lana spoke from a place of personal loss. For decades, she refused to accept the explanation that her sister's death was a simple accident, and her persistence played a crucial role in keeping the mystery alive long after official interest had faded. Lana's objections centered on what she viewed as irreconcilable contradictions. Foremost among them was Natalie's intense fear of dark water. According to Lana, this fear was so deeply ingrained that Natalie avoided being near the edge of boats even in daylight, let alone alone at night in rough seas. Lana has repeatedly stated that Natalie would never have gone onto the deck by herself, dressed in sleepwear, to handle a dinghy. To her, that scenario was not merely unlikely, it was impossible. This conviction was not based solely on emotion. Lana pointed to Natalie's lifelong habits, her cautious behavior around water, and her reliance on others for safety in such environments. Over the years, Lana's voice became a counterweight to official narratives, challenging the assumption that alcohol and medication alone could explain Natalie's actions. In her view, intoxication did not erase a lifetime of fear. Lana also became one of the strongest advocates for reevaluating Robert Wagner's behavior. She publicly questioned why, if nothing improper had occurred, Wagner would refuse to cooperate fully with investigators after the case was reopened. While acknowledging that silence could be a legal strategy, Lana argued that transparency would be the natural response of an innocent person seeking closure. Her repeated question, "If you have nothing to hide, why not speak?" resonated deeply with audiences who already felt unsettled by the timeline and shifting stories. In 2021, Lana published a memoir that reignited interest in the case. While much of the book focused on Natalie's life and career, it also revisited the circumstances of her death and the family's long frustration with unanswered questions. The memoir framed Natalie not just as a glamorous Hollywood icon, but as a vulnerable woman navigating fear, pressure, and personal trauma. This reframing mattered. It pushed back against narratives that reduced her final moments to recklessness or poor judgment. Lana's advocacy also highlighted the broader cultural environment of early 1980s Hollywood. She argued that the industry's instinct to protect its stars contributed to a rushed and incomplete investigation. At the time, powerful men were rarely challenged publicly, and uncomfortable truths were often suppressed for the sake of image. In that climate, Lana believed it was easier to accept an accident than to confront the possibility of wrongdoing involving a prominent actor. This perspective gained renewed relevance in later years, as public attitudes toward power, accountability, and historical injustice shifted. As society became more willing to revisit past cases with a critical eye, Natalie Wood's death was no longer seen as an isolated tragedy, but as part of a pattern in which celebrity status could soften scrutiny. Lana's long campaign ensured that her sister's case was ready for that moment of reassessment. Importantly, Lana never claimed to possess definitive proof of murder. Her argument was narrower, but no less forceful. The investigation was flawed, key questions were never answered, and the official record itself eventually acknowledged uncertainty. For Lana, justice did not necessarily mean a conviction. It meant honesty about what was known, what was unknown, and what may have been overlooked. By the time authorities formally described Robert Wagner as a person of interest and amended the cause of death to include undetermined factors, Lana felt vindicated, not because the mystery was solved, but because doubt had been officially recognized. Her decades-long insistence had helped shift the case from closure to caution. In the end, Lana Wood's role underscores why the Natalie Wood mystery endures. Facts may fade, witnesses may contradict themselves, and legal outcomes may remain elusive. But the refusal of those closest to the victim to accept easy answers ensures that the story does not disappear. It remains, instead, an open wound in Hollywood history, kept alive by a sister who would not let silence become the final verdict. More than 40 years after Natalie Wood's death, the mystery endures not because of a single dramatic revelation, but because the case steadily moved in the opposite direction of certainty. What began as an officially declared accident gradually unraveled into a collection of unanswered questions, questions that neither time nor authority has been able to silence. By the final stage of public scrutiny, the narrative had shifted decisively. The issue was no longer whether Natalie Wood drowned. Everyone agrees that she did, but how and why the circumstances surrounding her death were handled the way they were. Delayed alarms, conflicting testimonies, behavioral inconsistencies, and institutional revisions transformed the case into something far more complex than an unfortunate mishap at sea. The amended death certificate, listing drowning and other undetermined factors, stands as a quiet but powerful acknowledgement of uncertainty. It represents the moment when official confidence gave way to doubt, validating what skeptics had argued for decades. The available evidence does not support a single, clean explanation. Once that door opened, it could not be closed again. Equally significant was the decision by investigators to identify Robert Wagner as a person of interest. This designation did not accuse him of a crime, but it fundamentally altered the public framing of the case. Wagner was no longer simply a grieving husband caught in a tragic accident. He became a central figure whose actions, decisions, and shifting statements were considered critical to understanding what happened during the crucial hours Natalie was missing. His continued silence, while legally defensible, ensured that speculation would persist. What makes the Natalie Wood case especially haunting is how much appears to hinge on time. Minutes that passed without action, hours that slipped away before authorities were notified, decades that elapsed before witnesses felt safe enough to speak or revise their stories. On the ocean, time is unforgiving. In public memory, it is transformative. Each delay, whether in rescue, testimony, or investigation, reshaped the meaning of the event. Yet despite years of analysis, documentaries, books, and renewed investigations, no final answer has emerged. There's been no arrest, no trial, no definitive reconstruction of Natalie's final moments. What remains instead is a fractured truth, a series of plausible explanations that coexist without resolution. Accident, negligence, panic, concealment, each has evidence, and each has gaps. This unresolved state is precisely why the case continues to resonate. It reflects a broader discomfort with stories where power, reputation, and fear may have influenced outcomes. It challenges audiences to confront the limits of justice when evidence is incomplete and time has eroded clarity. And it reminds us that some mysteries persist not because the truth is unknowable, but because the moment to fully uncover it may have passed. Natalie Wood is remembered as a gifted actress and an enduring Hollywood icon, but her legacy is now inseparable from the questions surrounding her death. Until those questions are answered or formally laid to rest, the story of her final night will remain suspended between suspicion and silence, a reminder that not all tragedies find closure, even when the world is still watching.